cultural differences are an important thing, which we've already talked about a couple times already. But remember that there are lots of different ways of thinking about culture, and culture differs from country to country. You learned a lot of this already in Management 330. So there's all sorts of different dimensions on which cultures differ, but Hofstede's are the primary ones that we think about. There's all sorts of other aspects that are not as, they're important, but not as important. So those dimensions are individualism versus collectivism. And here in the United States, we're fairly high on individualism. We used to be the most individualistic. I'm not so sure anymore. Although certainly our current culture in the United States is all about, radical individualism. So perhaps that has shifted again. Um, and then you've got other countries that are much more collective in their style. African countries, for example, are very collective. They speak in terms of we, not I. China speaks in terms of we, not I. So those are much more collectivist cultures. And I don't mean Africa as a continent, but African countries, Kenya and Tunisia and the Sudan and Morocco and South Africa and what have you. And all of those have, broadly speaking, African cultures tend to be more collectivistic. So I just want to be careful that I am clear. Africa is a continent, not necessarily a country. And there's lots of variance, obviously, within that continent. Um, Power distance and the comfort with and respect for power distance. In Korea, there's high deference to power differences. In China, high deference to power differences. Where here in the United States, we're like, yeah, you think you're in charge, but you're not better than me. And so we see very big differences. We don't have the same sort of deference to power differences here in the United States. To some extent we do, but by and large, no, we don't. Whereas some Asian countries, although more collectivistic than we are, tend to defer to the higher powers in their culture. Uncertainty avoidance is how comfortable we are with uncertainty. In the United States, we're fairly comfortable with uncertainty, but Russia, on the other hand, does not like any uncertainty. So they result in a lot more control in the way that they manage their environments so that there is less unpredictability. Now, you can never remove that entirely, so that becomes sometimes, I think, a fruitless search for and an endless loop trying to find different ways to control things. But nonetheless, there's very few guarantees in life, and one of those guarantees are things are going to change, so there's going to be uncertainty when it comes to those changes. Lastly, they used to call it masculinity and femininity. I know that they've changed the name, but I don't have that off the top of my head right now. But that's the term that most people understand. And this has nothing to do with, are we more male-like or, more men versus women or things like that. But masculinity is more about what have traditionally been thought to be masculine values of power, leadership, control, and versus femininity, which is about collaboration and empathy and those sorts of things. And it's still a stereotype. We don't really use it a lot these days because, there is a lot of variance in the way we consider what is masculine versus feminine. Obviously, there's a huge debate out there about masculinity and toxic masculinity, and what that looks like. So I'm not going to step into that arena because there's a huge controversy around many of those things. But broadly, what we're talking about is, do we put more emphasis in our culture on leadership and strength and control versus collaboration, and empathy and things like that. And we tend to be a little bit more on the masculine side of things. Mexico is very masculine in its culture. Japan is very masculine in its culture. And Scandinavia is very feminine in its culture. They value collaboration, and things like that. And some of those differences create a problem when you're moving from one country to another. When we think about how we expect our meetings to run. Meetings will run very differently in cultures where there's high difference to power, versus a country where things feel more equalized. Like you're not more powerful than me, and even if you have a position higher than me, it doesn't mean that I can't speak up, you know, and question what you're doing. So when there are extreme differences between our culture and the country culture of another location, multinational countries, as I said, companies are way more likely to embrace a local, de- uh, decentralized approach to things because it's too difficult to make the cultures compatible. So we just have to recognize that, management practices are different from place to place and may be interpreted differently from place to place. And so we've got to make sure we are speaking the same language, and I don't mean that literally, but I mean it metaphorically, that when we are talking about certain behaviors, that we're very clear what that means, because it might mean something different in another country based on what their cultural norms are. So if we have a particular practice and we think it should be done this way, you might use the same words in another country, but it might mean something entirely different. So we want to make sure that we are clear about what, not just saying the thing that we want, but defining it and saying, and here's examples of what I am looking for. Your textbook highlights DHL as a company that thinks globally but acts locally. It has really clear values, and they empower their local branches to adapt as need be based on their locations and the country culture. But they do have a global training program to make sure everybody is clear about what the company values and what their core values are, and to make sure every their people's competencies are developed around the things that they want to have in common and consistent across those branches. So they understand, right, that there are some things that need to stay consistent, but they also allow for customization in local areas based on the needs of the local areas. Now, this might be a repeat for you in terms of corporate structures and how businesses are set up internationally, but let's just kind of review what they mean. You can have what we call a wholly owned subsidiary, where basically the parent company fully controls everything overseas. They are wholly owned, meaning they own it. There's no interference from other entities in other countries. There's no influence, company to company. And so I can control my subsidiary, the company doing business in that other location. And because I own it, then I can control it and what the culture and the rules and the norms are. A joint venture is where two companies come together and invest to create a new company. And in doing a joint venture, there is going to be some variance, particularly in what that culture looks like. Because if we've got two equals coming together to do a joint venture, and they are not compatible cultures, we're going to have to figure out how to manage so that new entity from the joint venture is going to meet the needs of both companies, right? So that it's going to be some amalgam of both of their cultures. It's different if you are acquiring somebody, then you can impose your culture on them and your structure and your styles. But when we are not doing that and we are creating a joint venture together, where not one company controls the other, you're going to have to compromise on what the culture is going to look like in that business. And then a strategic alliance is simply like, we're going to do something together. We're still two separate companies, but we're going to do something together. We're going to create a thing, and then we're going to, it may dissolve over time, and then that's fine. But all of these are very different in different structures that relate to how we might want to engage internationally. So now we get into the meat and potatoes of the HR stuff. Like, how does HR different globally. Let's talk about recruitment and selection, right? There are different rules for how we recruit and how we hire people, and different legal standards in different places. And you have to decide again how much is going to be centralized and how much is going to be decentralized or more locally controlled. Um, Obviously, um, if we had a certain brand recognition, that might work well in some countries, but not in others. So again, we may need to reframe how we market ourselves to hire people based on that. And we also need to look at the local availability of talent, because we can't export everybody from the United States and say, okay, now everybody's moving to Thailand to run this business, and so everybody from the US is going to take over that Thai business. It just doesn't work that way. You're going to have to hire locals, and so we need to know what the local labor market is like. Do people have the skills we need? Do they have the experience and the education that we need? And if they do, great, and then that's a good location in which to do business. And if they don't, we need to consider, does that mean that we need to go to a different country, or can we engage in training to get people up to speed? Now, think recently about the Hyundai plant that was in Georgia or South Carolina. I'm trying to remember now. And Korean nationals were there getting the business infrastructure set up. They had visas to be there. And then suddenly ICE was called, and all of those folks were sent back to South Korea. South Korea is upset because there was an agreement that if they wanted to have this plant, then they needed their people who were knowledgeable about their technology and their processes to be there to get it set up, to train the people who were going to then do the job, and then they were going to exit. So it was a temporary visa. They were only there for a short period. They're going to be there for only a short period of time. Now all that talent has gone back to South Korea, and the plant is in question right now, whether or not it'll be able to be functional, simply because they don't want to, South Korea is concerned about how to then control, locally the quality and the processes that they want to have centralized. So that's a concern for them. So different employees and mixes of employees, we're going to have, variance. Some countries we might have just a couple of executives, but everything is kind of locally controlled. Or we could have a predominance of U.S. influenced individuals who are there and doing the work. We're sending all the key employees there. They're doing their thing, and then they're kind of coming back, back and forth. And we rotate people in and out of those international assignments. The most important thing, though, is making sure you have the talent that you need, whatever that takes. Reward systems are going to be different. For example, what the salary standards are and what the legal implications are for how do we pay people and what that's supposed to look like. Remember a friend of mine whose father-in-law ran a business in Indonesia, and he noticed that there was a guy, an uncle of the family, who worked there but really never did anything. And he asked his father-in-law, well, why do we have him on board? I mean, he's costing you money, and, he's not doing anything. And the father-in-law was like, but he's the uncle, and we need to take care of him, and that's what we do here. We take care of family. Now, we might look at that and say, well, that's ridiculous, and he should be doing something productive to earn his salary. But in Indonesian culture, taking care of your family is incredibly important. So there are different standards. There's nothing illegal with what they were doing. My friend just simply questioned why it was so different than one would expect here in the United States. And it doesn't mean that nepotism and things like that don't occur here, but it's more common in some countries than others. So we have to make sure we have a good extrinsic reward system that rewards people. We have to acknowledge that different things motivate different people. Not only do we have variance here within the United States, but compare the United States to other countries, and there's also variance in what people value. So, for example, Indonesia values much more strongly the communal aspect of family and taking care of family, instead of like paying him, money under the table or paying him, as a stipend to have him just sit at home. He comes into work, he might do something, he might answer phones, he might, clean a toilet or what have you, but he doesn't really have a huge, he doesn't have a huge job, but he's getting money. It's supporting him. He feels supported, and and he feels productive. He feels like he's contributing, even if it's not a lot. That is more important in that culture. So knowing what motivates people, knowing what makes them happy, uh, more feminine cultures like Scandinavia value different kinds of benefits and they demand different kinds of benefits. Whereas here in the United States, we at a minimum get 6 weeks unpaid leave for maternity leave, or 6 weeks paid, and then anything more than that is unpaid. Um, in Scandinavia, people can get 1 to 2 years off and still be able to get their jobs back when they get rehired at the end of those 2 years. It's really interesting to see how the benefit expectations will differ depending on whether you're a more masculine or feminine culture. Um, and some people want the kinds of rewards and benefits that we get here in the U.S., and being able to share that abroad might start to change the local area and what the local area expectations are. So, if we offer something that is not offered in other countries, then that might actually be a good thing in terms of influencing that culture to be more responsive to employee needs. Most important thing, though, is remembering that just like within the U.S., people have different motivations. Across countries, there are different motivations, and we need to be familiar with what those differences look like.